Hello, my name is Shai. I want to show you this cool procedural design I made. It is a 4-leaf clover, and the animation looks like this. It's fully procedural. So the clover can kind of grow using this little slider here. Can shrink and grow. One of my favorite features of this clover are these crazy radial gradients, which are built using a gradient texture set to radial and a bunch of math nodes, and the final output looks something like this. And this output is cool because we can toss this into a float curve, which is similar to a color ramp in some ways, but this lets us change our values and our interpolation. So here we can make it softer or sharper and make some really cool patterns. And because it's procedural, we can simply increase the number of segments like that. So the gradients were used in all kinds of places. Every time I use a float curve, it's relating to these gradients. So in this case, I make one that looks like this. Here's another pattern, another. I think these just look really cool. I really enjoy the float curve graph. It's super versatile, but I also want to show you how I designed a 4-leaf clover using these float curves. Instead of me explaining it with words, let's just see what happens when I change this. You can see how I'm changing the design of our clovers while I move the handles on these graphs. So this is basically just changing each of these lobes. Each of these lobes follow this design pattern. And after a bunch of tweaking, you can make shapes like this, which look at least similar to a clover design. Another tool I use to make this is reference. So over here I have a reference image of just a normal 4-leaf clover that I found on Google, and I saw that they have these white stripes around the center of their leaves, and I thought, oh, I could make that procedural. So I implemented that in my shader using a circle that looks like this, and I added this to our clover design, but I then subtracted these kind of corner parts, which looks like this. And once I did this, I can add it over to our clover and get a pretty clean result like this. Another thing about the clover is that it has these random scratches and holes in it. I did that by first getting a gradient texture set to radial. And let's just show this as an example. I'm going to use less than to get these straight lines. But instead of having straight lines, I got a vector rotate node. It's pretty self-explanatory. And what I did with this is I got a noise texture and plugged it into the rotation, which gives us this random result. And as you can tell, it's rotating more the farther away, because to rotate something by 1 degree, the farther away it is, it has to rotate more, has to rotate faster, if that makes more sense. So when we rotate it by our noise, it's more drastic on the ends. If I increase the detail, it gets pretty cool. I can make this kind of foggy looking result. And because we can manipulate values, we can just add to rotate this. And I use that randomness to cut out parts that are near the ends of these clovers. So it looks a bit more frayed, you know, like our reference image. It's not perfect. One of my goals for this clover was to make it kind of like a neon sign. So outside of the shader, I enabled bloom in Eevee right here. And I changed the threshold, the knee, the radius. I changed some parameters to get this result. And I think it works great. I think it adds a nice futuristic kind of look. It's really a stylistic choice. So I've explained what this does, but this might be a bit confusing, how I've gotten these cool wave results using a wave texture, and it adds a nice leaf pattern to each of the lobes of this clover. I've done that using a wave texture, which I changed the vectors for. So over here, let's take a wave texture and let's use object coordinates. I'm going to change the distortion to 0 so it's simpler. And now I'm going to rotate it by 45 degrees. But before I use this vector rotate operation, I'm going to use another vector math node and set it to absolute. So I'm sure you know, the absolute node flips all negatives. So when we have a result, a Cartesian coordinate system like this, we can flip all the negatives, get this result. And now if we rotate it, we're essentially mirroring all of our waves on the X and Y. And of course, because this is a wave texture, we can easily distort this and add some cool realistic effects or unrealistic effects like this. One thing I really like about the wave texture is the phase offset, of course. It's such a cool parameter because you can set it to frame, divide by 30 or 20, and now you get a mesmerizing look. My max frame is pretty low, so it's not exactly looping. I'm gonna set this to 15, and now if we rotate it, we're getting like a kaleidoscope effect. It's pretty cool. This is made with only procedural shaders. I really like it. That's one of the reasons I really recommend you learn the nodes, because you can make super complex results, seemingly infinitely complex, because I have this detail slider, using only a few nodes. Okay, enough with the wave texture. Let's see how I implemented it to get this cool coloring effect. But this time I tossed it into a color ramp that interpolates between a desaturated bright green and a saturated dark green. This is what I will be using as the color in my clover. But it's not uniform. See how it's darker in the center and brighter around the middle, and then gets darker again. See how it makes kind of a ring shape? It's brightest around here in the middle, dark at the center point, and dark at the end. So I used this to influence the value of my colors, which, if you don't know HSV, value is just brightness, basically. I also used another radial texture that is rotated by 45 degrees to almost emulate the folds of the leaves, because they usually, if I look at my reference image, have this kind of fold here in the center. And for the animation, if we imagine a gradient using object coordinates, let's get a gradient texture. If we imagine a gradient like this, we have a value of 0 in the center and a value of 1 on the ends. But if we clamp this, we can limit the max value, if that makes sense. We can limit the brightest and the lowest points. So what I'm doing is that I'm eliminating everything above a certain value and everything under another value. So let's see how that works. Here I have a greater than node, and if I increase my threshold, I'm choosing what goes invisible, if that makes sense. As I increase it, we're gonna see only the brightest points, and later on, it becomes completely dark. So nothing is brighter than a value of 1.3. If we increase our threshold slowly though, we have this kind of growth effect. That's because I'm not actually using solid colors. I'm using a noise that is set to, here's the noise I'm using. It's set to a dark saturated green and a bright desaturated green. And that means that they have different values. So we get these very slight details, which are only made possible by that noise, because I'm not using solid colors. So that's another layer of imperfections that I'm using to really sell the idea that this is a real clover, not a photorealistic clover, but a stylized one. So if we set this to 0, everything above a value of 0 will be visible. And this does have an alpha transparent background, as in if I change my world colors, you can see that only the green is showing, even though we do have a plane. Everything with a value of 0 will become transparent. This is one of my most common node setups for hiding everything with a value of 0. Just using mix shader between transparent and your colors, and using a greater than as a factor. And this runs in real time in 3D. It can be rendered out in both cycles and Eevee, which is what I'm using now. But if I switch to cycles, we can focus in on some very specific parts like this, and we can see the level of detail. And all of this detail is optional. So you can change sliders to make this a very simple looking clover or a stylized one, or you can make this look really realistic, or somewhere in between, like what I did. So this could very easily be used as a neon sign. I hope that was a cool deep dive into my process and how I use the float curve node to make some cool shapes. I think the float curve node is pretty underrated. I'm gonna show you how I can make a really intricate shape using a very simple node setup. Let's cut to that. So here we have a super rudimentary node system, but I can use this to draw all kinds of shapes, stuff like parabolas. So here I can make all kinds of shapes using my float curve node. Just 4 nodes making this output is really cool. If you drag and drop these handles, it won't run in real time. But if you change these parameters, you can run it in real time. And if I change the value, we can slide it up and down because it's a compare node. So I hope you had fun watching. I would love to inspire your next project involving float curves or really any kind of procedural madness. If you like this video, it would really help out if you shared it or liked it. Thanks. By the way, quick secret, if you subscribe, you instantly unlock the power of Node. Wow.